At 85, he's still climbing mountains. At 85, he's still pressing on. At 85, he is still hanging on to the promises of God, even though it's been a long time in coming. He had a good attitude. You know, the same thing applies to a church. It applies to a nation. It applies to an individual. It's not how old we get in years. It's how old we get in our attitude and our thinking. Caleb lived in a changing environment. Just think about that. 40 years in the wilderness, and some would estimate that there were from 1 million to maybe maximum of 3 million people who came out of Egypt to go into the promised land. Now, God said they're not, because of their grumbling and their complaining, they're not going to see my promised land. If they're 20 years old and up, they're all going to die in the wilderness. Do you know how many funerals they had every day for 40 years? At somewhere between 70 and 120 every day. Don't you think that would wear on your attitude after a while? Caleb saw all of his generation die. Only he and Joshua were the only two of his generation who entered into the land, because they kept the distance between them and God closed. I can't help but remember in the late 60s when I went to First Baptist Watertown, something else was happening in our country. Started out on the West Coast. It was known as the Jesus Movement. Any of you remember that? Well, you know, I think the Church of America probably missed the greatest opportunity in the last 100 years during the 60s and early 70s. Because the young people then were talking about the right person. They were talking about Jesus. And you know what? Many people rejected the Jesus movement because they looked too much like the hippie generation out of which they came. They had long hair, and you remember all that psychedelic clothing and stuff we used to wear and all that sort of thing. And so there were those who said, we can't accept this. Even the music began to change. I was a pastor, young pastor at Watertown, and I remember the Jesus movement kind of hit us, and we were in a state of revival for about 18 months. People were being saved. The young people in the church were excited. I was doing a Bible study and worship service in the high school in Watertown. Probably couldn't do that now, but I did then. And it was an exciting time. And you know how the music changed? You know what the contemporary music was in the early 70s? Bill Gaither. Do y'all know any Bill Gaither songs? Yeah. I mean, now we sing Bill Gaither out of the hymnal. Isn't it strange? Well, Caleb grew up in these kind of changing atmospheres. But remember, age is not the problem. Attitude is the problem. Now, having lived in Europe for the last 10 years, I can tell you that the world is changing. America is changing rapidly. And we don't need to be a part of the problem. We need to be a part of the solution. Amen? No matter how old we are or how young we are. And the people of Jesus' day, they missed what Jesus was doing because of their traditions. And we must be careful of that. Fourth thing, we must choose not to be a grasshopper. Back in Numbers chapter 13, we have the rest of the story, and I don't have time to go back there and read it, but it says this, that these 10 spies, when they went in the land and came back and gave the report, they said, we saw giants in the land, and in our own eyes we were grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. Notice the order there. He didn't say, we saw the giants, and the giants saw us as grasshoppers. That's not what he said. said we saw the giants, and then we started looking at ourselves, and we saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and then that's how they viewed us. I want to tell you, the enemy of your life will view you with the same view you have of yourself. That's why it is so important to choose never to live a grasshopper life. We've got too many Christians who live like grasshoppers. Not only hop from here and there, but we have the attitude that every little problem that comes along can just crush us, and we're not victorious, and we look at problems as if they are massive and large, and we are so small and insignificant. Here is this man, 40 years of age, marching into the land. He saw the giants in the land, and you know how Caleb saw himself? I'm a giant killer. That's what he saw himself as. Why? Because he had faith in God who could deliver him from his enemies. You and I must not live grasshopper lives. We must live giant killer lives. And that's what makes us part of the Caleb generation. Now, the last thing is important. We must choose to acquire the best no matter the cost. Hebron, the word itself literally means the friend. Hebron has a long history. It was where Abraham, when he came out of Mesopotamia, came down into what we know today as Israel, the Holy Land. Hebron is where Caleb set up an altar. Abraham set up an altar. It's where Abraham lived. It's where Sarah, his wife, died, and he bought the cave of Machpelah and buried Sarah there. He is buried there. Isaac is buried there. Jacob is buried there. It is a very sacred site, Hebron. And so, not only that,